It's extremely important, I think, to not assume the terms by which you're being persecuted. In other words, IS, their worldview is entirely derived from their understanding of their religion. But for us, it's not a question of religion. I mean, we can be secular or Christian anywhere in the world, but what we're losing is our connection to our culture, our language, our heritage, our homes, our communities, all the things that actually constitute us as an ethnic people. So even though we're being persecuted for religious reasons, for us, the loss is the loss of our home, basically.
As someone of Assyrian descent, your reaction to that which we're hearing? We haven't seen the pictures just yet, although we're certain that some will follow, but this is a cultural act of violence.
These are spectacular gestures of malign thuggery and cruelty that are designed to sever the Assyrians and other people of Iraq from their past, and to pave the way more comprehensively for a totalitarian vision of the Islamic State, in which material culture and music and art and literature and all the things that civilizations, Eastern and Western civilizations, prize, have no place. And it's taking place at the same time as an attack on ethnic Assyrians themselves. So it's simultaneously an assault on memory, on history, and through the ethnic cleansing of Assyrians in the north of Iraq and in Syria, that has been taking place recently and is ongoing currently. The Islamic State also wishes to eradicate the contemporary living history that Assyrians embody today.
And what do you make of the words of UNESCO, the UN organisation with responsibility for heritage sites like this, saying that this is a war crime? Well, that may well be the case, but UNESCO have remained silent on previous occasions where crimes of this magnitude have taken place.
Well, I mean, international organisations like UNESCO and the UN itself are very good at producing language. I mean, their primary function is basically to produce language, but they're not so good at combating groups like ISIS. So in terms of if I were a member of the Islamic State and I read that quotation, I wouldn't be quaking in my boots, because to say to people who are ransacking towns and villages, destroying cemeteries as they did in Tel Kif, which is another gesture aimed at stopping the repopulation of these villages that they emptied, and demoralizing the inhabitants who might want to return or find a way to live in Iraq, their indigenous habitat. And I read a UNESCO quotation saying that we've now decided that we think this is a war crime along with the other war crimes that you're committing, and we'll take you to task at a certain undefined point in the future once all of this is settled down. It wouldn't mean anything.
Is it only going to be a violent solution to this problem?
Well, no solution for any state in as much trouble as Iraq and Syria are in can be purely military. But on the other hand, the military outcome seems more feasible in a sense than the political one. I mean, the political one's even more complicated in Syria. So basically, this should be understood as one illustration of the ideology and the purpose and the vision of the Islamic State. I mean, the idea that this should trigger international action by itself is absurd and really is insulting to the hundreds of thousands of people who are displaced and suffering. But it does inform us more vividly of what these people are about and what their attitude is towards all the things that you and I and other people prize as important and essential to life.
Mardean, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your insight on this. Mardean Isaac.
Thank you.
We all feel deeply disturbed and saddened when we see the images of the destruction of ancient material culture, because it touches the deepest part of us. I mean, it's part of us that's rooted in a time when we began to become who we are as individuals and as societies, and we began to create the kinds of aesthetic systems of thought that we still hold dear today.
As early as 2007, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimated that a third of the 1.8 million refugees outside of Iraq were Christians, so you can observe the disproportionate figure there in the context of the general Iraqi demographic. That was due to relentless harassment, intimidation, threats, violence, rapes, and other atrocities. The turmoil engendered in these communities, of course, ruins every aspect of normal life: employment, education, freedom of association, tears communities apart due to the flight of influential figures, and the severing of bonds between people who would otherwise support each other. There's been a mass closure of liquor stores, historically the province of the Yazidis and Assyrians for religious reasons. Assyrian and Mardean pharmacists and teachers have been targeted as well. And the process is very similar. Notes are left on the doors of homes, sometimes with a bullet affixed to them, saying you're an infidel, you're a crusader, pay us jizya, we'll kill you. Kidnappings are very common and continue to be. A 16-year-old Assyrian girl was kidnapped in Baghdad just a couple of weeks ago. So, to be blunt, things are so bad in Iraq that the instinctive feeling that many other Iraqis might have and do have, and I know some of them feel this way, when confronted with this history, is that, well, this is what's happening to us too. These processes I described were very familiar to all of the inhabitants of Baghdad. The difference being that the three indigenous populations of Iraq, Mandeans, Yazidis, and Assyrians, are being specifically targeted for their powerlessness as well as their religion, being bled of their possessions and wealth to fuel the religious war engulfing the country, and have no legal or political recourse, no effective, even if belligerent patronage, nor even the highly problematic, yet presence-maintaining possibility of armed defense in the form of militias. They're actually disappearing from the face of the earth as continuous millennial populations which carry the living history of the earliest civilizations, languages, and cultures. I think what we're seeing here could be described as the inverse logic of tourism. So whereas traditional states use heritage sites and the imagery of heritage sites as part of their national iconography and as part of their presentation to the world, I think the more comprehensive the Islamic State is in doing away with what came before it, the more it can extend a collective psychological, ideological and cultural control over the populations that in the areas that it controls.
It's very effective propaganda, very sophisticated, as you say, techniques being used, but who is being attracted to these sorts of videos?
Well, it's a gamble, and it's a gamble which will have mixed results, but I mean, in a very broad sense, is working very well. It will magnetize people who have a fetish for such destruction. It will bring together people who are sick of the factionalism and fissures that exist within Sunni groups in Syria and Iraq, and covet the kind of administrative and ideological comprehensiveness that the Islamic State possesses. And in terms of people who don't support such barbarism and extremity, it will psychologically demoralize them, and it is destroying symbols of pride and unity that have acted as sources of cohesion for the populations of these states. So I think it serves several purposes at the same time. If you were a man or a woman who's taking up arms, one of the central questions is, if not the central question, is to what extent are you fighting for something or against something? I think with the majority of the other well, I mean, I wouldn't classify ISIS as a rebel group per se. I mean, that's kind of my point. The other Islamist organizations that have been focused on bringing Assad down and changing the government of Syria have been mired in inherently pettier matters than ISIS would like us to think they are engaged in. In other words, ISIS is trying to create the impression and is trying to materially impose something that doesn't exist in the region. It's not interested in the kind of the patchwork of shifting allegiances and so on that define the less ideologically coherent Islamist organizations. So I think its purpose is simply to create something, and it might seem paradoxical to people who aren't familiar, who don't understand the concept of creation to destruction. But they're trying to create something that isn't there before, that's more that hasn't been there before, that's new, and that's more transcendent than what their rivals are offering.
Journalist Mardean Isaac specializes in Syrian analysis. He says at least some of the artifacts at the site would have been sold on the black antiques market.
I think we're confronting a very troubling paradox when it comes to the fate of these antiquities, namely that if we want to preserve them, we have to buy them from the Islamic State. And we have been doing that over the last year, and before that we were doing it when other groups, other Islamist groups were smuggling these artifacts out of the country. And in doing so, we of course further the Islamic State war machine. The ones that are more mobile are saleable, and the ones that aren't end up being destroyed in these spectacular acts.
But the genocide term also presents us with difficult problems. It exists in a vexingly nebulous space between truth and presenting that truth to the world, separated by the unseemly competitive process of proving a case, with all the political obstacles and moral and legal contests that come along with it. The birth of the term genocide came alongside the globalization of the language in which we spoke about the world. Universal conceptions, international institutions, and ostensibly values and rights that were the property of all humankind meant a chance to enforce a standard of ethics and principles above and across nations and people. Enlightenment notions of natural law and natural rights became codified into systems, coinciding with the birth of the UN and other global bodies. Which brings me to perhaps the biggest problem with the concept of genocide. The idea that in identifying it and constructing systems based on the collective understanding that we have a duty to stop it, that we in fact stand a better chance of doing so. This has largely proved not to be the case, and it has led to a reflexive recourse to phrases like the international community and human rights that have blinded people to the uninterruptible engine of material history, and so to the reality of how things actually work. In effect, the attachment of our consciences to this right of appeal has become like praying to a God that doesn't exist.